Hi everyone and welcome to the Publishing Format Show. I'm joined today with Louise Harris, who is the founder and the president of Last Research and Editing, a business which specialises in doing editing of books and things like that. So thank you very much, Louise, for joining us.
Thank you, Teddy, for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
Great, thank you. Well, why don't we do a bit of a background into you and how you got started in editing and what drew you to the world of books?
Sure. Okay, so I always knew I was going to be a writer. At age 12, I published my first poem and I got paid for it. So when I was looking into colleges, I wanted to go into journalism because I wanted to be able to provide people the information that they needed. So I went to the University of Maryland, College of Journalism, and when I came out, I was offered two reporting jobs and one editing job. And I took the editing job because it worked better with my schedule and it was more flexible and it was closer to home and it was also more money. So that's what got me into editing. But in college, I actually found out that I am a better editor than I am a writer. So I like reading other people's stuff and correcting other people rather than correcting my own stuff. So it was really those two things that brought me into editing, is that I really am good at it. So.
Are you quite bossy? You like correcting other people's work?
I do. My family makes fun of me because, I'll see something on TV or I'll hear someone say an incorrect English and I'll immediately correct them and it will just come out of my mouth and I won't even be thinking about it. I'll just,
Do you have a big collection of red pens to strike lines through words and things like that?
Yes, I do. All colors, actually. Yeah. I like to do like green at Christmas time and pink in Easter time. So I'll use a bunch of different colors. But that actually brings up a point about editing books for clients. I usually print them out and read them on paper because you catch more. So I will use my pens rather than doing it on the computer. You catch more mistakes.
I'm getting flashbacks to school when I'm getting flashbacks to school when your teacher would just put red lines through your work.
Although nowadays with my kids, everything was on the computer, so they didn't have that where the teachers crossed it out. But yes, I am an old school person.
Yeah, why not? So when you edit your books, so that's one of the main jobs of Last Research, one of the main services that you guys provide. So you say like you've got great attention to detail, and that's what you enjoy doing. So could you tell me a bit about what editing means? Because I know that there's lots of different types of editing, like from developmental editing all the way to line editing, but they're a bit different. So tell me a bit about what editing is for people who don't know, and also the different types of editing.
I tend to be a comprehensive editor. It's when I'm working on nonfiction versus fiction. Fiction, the developmental editor is more common in fiction than is in nonfiction. And comprehensive is somebody who will do both developmental and line editing and copy editing. So it's all in one. But the differences are this. A developmental editor is someone who's looking at the big picture, looking for plot holes, looking for things that the author might have missed or things that might make the story better, adding action. So they're not really looking at the nitty-gritty such as grammar or lines or awkwardness. They're just looking at the big picture and whether the outline fits the story and the plot. A copy editor or a line editor, they're pretty much the same thing. They're basically looking for grammar, awkward sentences, spelling errors, and things that don't quite fit that need to be eliminated. And then there is a proofreader, which is the very last person. And the proofreader is basically looking for typos. When you're formatting the book, things happen like there's widows. A widow is a line that is at the end of a book that doesn't connect, or an orphan is on the second page, but it's just one line. So a proofreader is looking for those kind of things and for spelling errors that came from typos. One of the problems with spell check is, and voice editing is that you have words like there, and there. So might be spelled one way, but then they'll show up a different way in the copy. And that's one of the reasons why I print my book, because when I'm editing, because your ear, when you're reading it out loud, will catch those awkward things, but when you're doing it on a computer, you won't necessarily catch them. And when you're reading it on paper, you will see that this is the wrong word choice, but you won't necessarily on a computer. So that's why you need a proofreader, because some of those things do get through, even after 4 or 5 minutes.
Right. Okay. And when you're doing the proofreading, for example, obviously in America, you spell everything incorrectly compared to us over here. So do you do everything in the same version of English?
Well, there's different styles, but yes, I do. I tend to only work with American authors or Canadian authors, and I know Canadian is British English too, but they are usually happy using American English. But within the American English, there are different styles. There's the Chicago manual style, there's the Associated Press style, there's the academic style. I tend to use the Associated Press style because that's what I was taught in college. So, and most books do not want the academic. That's really just for the colleges when they're publishing papers and stuff. So most books are okay, or most authors, I should say, are okay with the Associated Press style. So that's what I tend to use.
So I'm guessing, yeah. So I'm guessing line and copy editing, they're the more basic functions. Maybe they're the slightly cheaper ones if people are on a budget and they aren't able to do that sort of full edit. Whereas the developmental edit, it sounds like it's much more of a case of you're working with the editor in order to produce the final outcome.
That's true. A developmental editor is also known as a writing coach, and they are doing so much more, and they're with you so much earlier in the writing process that yes, they tend to get more money. The copy editing and line editors, if you don't have a big budget and you just want to use a copy editor, you're probably okay with that. And the only issue is that you might not miss the plot holes that a developmental editor would find, or problems with the outline. Because the other important thing of editors, which we haven't talked about, is flow. And that's to make sure the story flows from sentence to sentence, paragraph to paragraph, and then chapter to chapter, all the way to the end. And that's what a good comprehensive editor or developmental editor will be able to do for you, is make sure it flows correctly.
Right. Because when I read novels and stories, often at the acknowledgements at the back, the writer is usually praising their editor and saying, thank you for helping me do the edit. I'm guessing that is a classic developmental editor where they've worked with them throughout the whole process,
Yes.
spotted things like plot holes, like you mentioned. So that plot holes, could that be things like where the dates don't line up, or where you've said that someone lives at one address and maybe they've said something lives at a different address later on down the line? Is that
yes, things like
sort of
that.
thing?
Also, my first novel, I had a character in there who could turn himself invisible. And when I mentioned it to my husband, he said, well, when he turns invisible, what happens to the clothes? Something I didn't think about, but my engineer husband did. And so I had to put in, there's a scene where the judge is asking that question so that I could tell the readers what happens to the clothes. So things like that are plot holes that you don't always think about as an author.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's amazing. And also, you got when I go on Reddit nowadays, there's a couple of books I love, and I'm a member on there, some of their forums talking about the characters, and you get the real book nerds go on there and say, "Oh, there's a plot hole here where this doesn't match up to
Yeah.
what's going on," and that must be quite embarrassing to get caught on.
And don't you just love when going to a movie and you see something glaring in the movie and you're like, well, they could have just done this. And you don't want that in a book. You don't want it in a movie either, but it happens. And
Yeah, definitely.
so,
Yeah, I remember seeing in I remember seeing Game of Thrones. There were some scenes where people had left their Starbucks cups on the table and stuff like that, and so the editor hadn't done their job properly. um,
exactly.
so, when it comes to organizing and structuring a book, do you have any advice for authors who are still in the writing phase? For example, if they're thinking about getting a developmental editor, is that someone they should be hiring like at the beginning of the process,
They should
or can they
definitely
do it later on?
hire the developmental editor when they have the book idea and maybe when they've created an outline. Because if you're too far into the book and then you hire the person, you're going to have it's going to be harder for the developmental editor to help because you have already gone too far. So yes, as early as possible, you want to have the developmental editor in the process.
So, say for example, I've come up. We're talking about fiction books, so we'll come on to
Right.
non-fiction in a bit. But talking about fiction books, if I've got an idea for a book, and is it literally just the idea? You might have a few bullet points or something sketched out. That would be enough to go to a developmental editor and say, this is what I'm working with. I've got my invisible man. His clothes don't go invisible, but he's in trouble with the law. Let's go and work out this story. That's kind of where you go to the developmental editor and get them to
Yes, you
brainstorm it with
could
you.
do
Is
it.
that how that works?
You do it that early, and you'll basically be collaborating on a finished product, or you could do it where you pretty much have an idea of how the plot's going to go, but you need help figuring out like the scenes from 1 to 20. But yes, as early as you can in the writing process, you want to bring in the developmental editor.
So you wouldn't even need to have a. You mentioned some of the plot lines and where the story goes. Do you have any advice for how in depth that needs to be before you go and hire an editor?
It doesn't have to be that in depth. It just has to have some kind of framework that the editor can work from. If the editor doesn't, if you're just, hey, I have this idea and I need to flesh it out, then you're really hiring a coach. But as I said, a coach is often the same as a developmental editor too. But if you're an author and for myself, I always know how my stories begin and I always know how they end. And then as I write it, that's where the rest of it comes in. So if you have an idea that this is going to happen in the climax, but I don't know how to get there, then you want to talk to either a writing coach or a developmental editor to help you get there and give you ideas and flesh out some of those bullet points that you're talking about. But, so, and often what happens is an author will start writing and then will have to change direction because it won't flow the way they originally wanted it if they stick with what they had originally planned. So I
Yeah,
recently
that's
worked
really
with an
interesting. I
I recently worked with an
Sorry.
author in Louisiana who wanted to have basically a levee system that was controlling the Mississippi River, and he wanted something to happen to that levee system. And we went back and forth. I convinced him that we need more than just this one thing happening. We need to add more tension. So we ended up in the climax. A tornado took out a transformer. A big storm knocked out part of the structure. A power failure took out some of the other structure. And then the antagonist took out the rest of the structure. So there was many different elements in that climax that really kept the action. and you didn't know which one was going to cause the problem. So
Yeah. Nice. Have you got any good examples about where you've been a developmental editor or a book coach with someone and you've caught out some, mistakes, or you've helped them to make the book better?
almost every single one of my clients, their issue is flow. They don't really connect A to B or B to C. And so I'm always reorganizing it so it flows better. And so my advice would be read your own stuff. A lot of authors, after they write it, they don't want to read it because they think they're done. They think it's fine. But if you print it and read it out loud, you can catch a lot of things on your own without hiring an editor. And then you can hear things that are awkward, that aren't working right. And the other issue that I always have with clients is they want to keep things that I think are either not necessary or slow down the story. And so I'm constantly arguing with them, like, this isn't really going to work. You need to get rid of this. And because it's their baby, they don't want to get rid of it. And it's very hard for them they want everything is what they wrote, and they don't see why it's unnecessary. And so I do a lot of explaining. So that's something else, that if you read it out loud and before you go to an editor, that you'll be able to see some of that stuff, that hey, we mentioned this several chapters ago, we don't have to have it again. Or this is slowing the story and the readers are stopping, and you don't want readers to stop. So in a story,
Yeah. It's really interesting because hearing you speak about it, I hadn't really thought about how in depth this process could be, because my books are mostly in nonfiction. So the developmental editing probably doesn't come into it quite as much, because I'm usually giving my experiences or stuff that I know about, rather than creating like a story that needs to flow from A to B. So it's really fascinating hearing you talk about this.
the nonfiction
When you're
has
working
to
with,
flow as well, but it's a different type of flow. It's more of it depends on the kind of nonfiction. A lot of books that I do are business books, which are helping salespeople, or I did a book on back injuries and how to not use surgery to fix some of those back injuries. And I also did a recent book it was a political book on things that are happening in the American government. So in those two cases, the person came to me with a bunch of information, but they had no clue how to put it together. And I still had to provide them that comprehensiveness to get it to flow correctly and to put it together. So even though it's nonfiction, it still has to make sense when you're going from chapter to chapter. And now the chapters might have different topics, that's fine. But if you have one chapter on education, you want to start the next chapter with, a transition, something like, in the last chapter, we talked about education. Now we're going to talk about, and then you can transition to the next chapter. So that's kind of what I do for nonfiction authors.
yeah, that's that's really interesting. So if someone was a nonfiction writer, what level of information do you think they would need to come to you with in order to get help with that developmental editing?
I've had clients all over the scale. I've had authors like the two I just said who had no clue how to put it together as a book. And then I was basically coaching them through the whole thing and reorganizing. And then I've had authors who would come to me with a finished manuscript, and basically I'm just doing line editing and making sure everything isn't awkward, and I would, still make sure it flows, but it's a simpler process. I'm basically just doing step 4 or 5. And then I've had authors where they needed help right from the beginning, where I'm helping them create an outline and things like that, and then going from there. So all over the
Yeah.
spectrum.
Right. Yeah, no, of course. So talking about the editing, it sounds like it, especially with developmental editing, it's a different process for each client. It sounds like you speak to them and you understand what they need and give them a different level of service. So would you don't necessarily have a package that people can buy and say, oh, this is exactly the same for everyone. It sounds like it would be slightly different for each author you worked with.
I do customize for every client based on what they need from me. However, I do have packages as well. Like I will offer them certain editing and then maybe marketing too. Or I'll offer them comprehensive editing or developmental editing, and then they'll need line editing later. And so I'll offer them as part of the package as well. So the two different kinds of editing. So, but it does depend on what the client has a budget for and needs, and when I read their information, it's always good to, when you're assessing an editor, to give them something that they can read, like the first chapter, and then they can figure out where to go from there, or an outline or something that they can assess the client as well as the client assessing the editor. So the editor could do, I tend to do this. I don't, not a lot of editors don't, but I tend to give the first, chapter for free. If they want to see how well I can edit, I will do it and not charge them for that. But a lot of editors will also charge them a small fee to do that test. It all depends on the person and how they do their editing. But as I said, I will edit one chapter for free if they want to see my editing style. So,
Great. That's great. So you can get a good idea for sort of what the final product is going to look like before you can commit to the entire book.
Right.
I think that's really helpful. For authors who are maybe on a bit of a budget, are there any ways that they can do any of this themselves or reduce their spend on like the final editing process? I know you don't want to be, because you don't want to cut corners. You don't want to.
The first thing is printing it out and reading a hard copy of your book. That's the first thing that every author should do. And they should do it whether they're going to hire an editor or not, because you do not want to give an editor the first draft. You don't even want to give them a second draft, third maybe, but you want it as polished as possible, or you want as much information. You want to give the editor as much information as you have so that they can assess how to fix it. That's the first thing, that they should read it out loud. The second thing they can do is Grammarly is a very good software program that'll allow you to catch some mistakes. The problem that I always have with using computer tools, though, is when the computer is programmed incorrectly, then it's going to say something is correct when it isn't correct. And sometimes computers, again, with the words that sound the same but are spelled differently, the computer doesn't always pick up the misspelling or the incorrect word choice. And the computer doesn't, you will think something, if the computer says something is correct that isn't, you will assume that it's correct when it isn't, and then you'll publish your book with errors. So I suggest using the tools, but be cautious about it. They're not always accurate, and then you have to know what to do. But that's a way to save money. Another way is using services like Upwork or Fiverr. You can usually find inexpensive editing on those sites. They're not always good quality, and they're not always going to work with you and collaborate with you, but there are options that way as well.
Yeah. I find the problem with using Grammarly is often, especially if you use their text correction, is your text ends up sounding like it was written by Grammarly rather than written by you. So
right.
it's
That's
quite good for doing spell check, but if you get it to change, if you get it to change whole sentences, then it ends up being like a ends up sounding a bit like a corporation wrote it rather than you wrote it. It's
right, a computerese, and that's a problem with AI as well. It sounds very computer like, and it doesn't sound like a human wrote it. So you have to be careful with that as well. And if Grammarly says a sentence is awkward, then you should step back and rewrite the sentence, not let Grammarly rewrite it, because like you said, it's going to be very stale and not at all like it should be. So, and that's another way
great.
that editors work versus computers, because editors can reword something so that it doesn't sound stale. It all depends on author's budget. And I do understand that authors don't have a lot of money, but,
Yeah. That's really interesting. Now, one of the other things you talk about on your website is book compilation, and it sounds like a bit of a different service. And I haven't seen that come up too often with other people. So can you tell us a bit about how that works and what sort of authors would benefit the most from it?
Yeah, so a book compilation is really two different services lumped into one. One service is if you're writing an anthology and you just want to contribute to a larger book, then what I would do as editors, take out all those freelance authors and put them into one book and compile it into a book. Another way of using compilation is if you're an author of blogs and you want to take those blogs and make them into a book. I can compile it into a book and make it flow into one topic. So, and I've done that actually. I have a client he has a company that provides press release distribution services. And I wrote all these blogs for him for his website, but he wanted to take those blogs and make it into a book that he could hand out to potential clients and show them the kind of work that we do. So I took those blogs that we wrote and I compiled them into a book that he could give out. And then I did all of the editing and made it flow. The thing with compilation is each blog has its own headline. So you want to remove those headlines, but still make sure that it connects from the beginning to the end. So it's not as in-depth of a service as I provide other clients, but it's something that is easy to do. And if you're someone who would like to have a book to show that you have an authority, but you don't know how to get started, this is a simple way of getting started, is by using your blogs that you put on your website and creating a book out of it. So.
Brilliant. Well, that's a really great service, because loads of people I speak to have got blogs. I've got a couple of blogs, in fact, that I write on, and that would be great to take that content and put it into a book, because it gets your information, your content that you've already written. That means that you can sell it on multiple platforms. So you can sell it on Amazon, sell it even in bookshops. That's right. Such a great service that you offer.
And it doesn't take as long. You could have it done probably in a couple of weeks to have a book out from your blogs.
So how would that work? Would I give you, for example, 10 or 20,000 words from my blog and say, could you organize this into a book for me?
Yes, you would send me links to the blogs, or you would send me the actual Word documents of the blogs, and then I would just do what I always do for other authors and just make a book out of it. And and again, make it sure that it reads well and it's all one topic, and that there's little different chapters and stuff. But yes, that's basically what I would do, is just take the blogs and reformat it into a book.
That sounds too good to be true in some ways.
Well, as I said, I have done it for other clients, and I have compiled anthologies as well. So I've compiled them for associations. They're usually the ones who want a contributor type of anthology that would need compilation, because they have all their members are writing one chapter. And so then they would want that into a book. So those are the two, usually nonprofit associations or people that want to turn their blogs into a book.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. I have to definitely go and check that service out. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I mean, that's been great. I've learned so much about developmental editing, compiling books into different your blogs into a book and things like that. There's a lot to learn for beginners and also for people who are maybe getting a bit more experience and want to take their books to the next step. If people want to get in contact with you, where's the best place to do that?
Well, my website is lastresearchandediting.com, and it's AND, not ampersand. I also have a author page on Amazon, so you can do amazon.com/author/Louise Harris. My phone number is 480-370-3945. And then I also have email, which you can access through my website. So
great. And we'll put the links to all that stuff in the show notes as well, so people can. Sorry, I said we'll put links to all that stuff in the show notes as well, so that people can click on those links and then get in touch with you.
I appreciate that.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate your time here. So just before you go, we have one final question, and that is what book do you recommend that everyone should be reading at the moment?
Okay, well, I was going to recommend my clients' books just to boost their sales, but I actually think that, The Places You Go by Dr. Seuss, it was actually given to, I think, my father on his 50th birthday. It is a kid's book, but it's also an adult book. And when you read it as a kid, it makes sense as a kid. But then when you read it as an adult, you're like, oh, yeah, I should take this advice and follow my dreams. That's basically the point of it. Follow your dreams. So I'll leave you with that one because it's...
Oh, great. Thanks. The Dr. Seuss books are famous in the UK, but it's mostly the kids' books. So yes. That's interesting that you've got that one. So
yeah, and again, it is written the same style for kids, but it has different levels on that particular book. So it is a really good one to follow your dreams.
Nice. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Louise, and we'll speak again soon.
All right, thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Publishing Performance podcast. I really hope you found today's episode inspiring. I love chatting to authors, writers, and people in the publishing world. Now, just before we wrap up, let me tell you about Publishing Performance, the #1 platform for authors who want to increase Amazon book sales, but are not really sure where to start. Now, this show is all about helping you to sell more books. And if you're looking to boost your publishing game and to maximise your book's potential on Amazon, then Publishing Performance is designed to help authors just like you to grow your readership and to reach a much wider audience. Now, I know that Amazon ads can be slightly complicated, which is why Publishing Performance is like having a personalised ad account manager to create your ad campaigns, to choose your best keywords, and to make adjustments in real time. Now, if you're investing in ads, you really want to make sure that your investment is being used effectively, and Publishing Performance does just that. It aims to make your budget go further, improve your organic rank, and target keywords more effectively. Just go to publishingperformance.com to get started with Amazon ads for just $1.